who's a professor and honorary consultant in diabetes with a special interest in type 1 diabetes and technology. He has active clinical and research programs around education, psychology, and technology in type 1 diabetes. In particular, his research uses neuroimaging to explore the mechanisms of hypoglycemia and awareness. He has been involved in a number of national and international research studies, as well as a number of national and international training and education programs. He's currently the chair of Diabetes Technology Network UK, and he's working to improve access to technology. He's also a member of the EASD Postgraduate Education Committee and the Medical Advisory Panel. He would be talking on fast-acting insulins, more hoopla or hype, or actually they're good, in this insulin symposium. And Dr. Pratik Choudhary is a professor and honorary consultant in diabetes at the University of Leicester. My proud privilege to invite Dr. Pratik Choudhary.
Thank you, Surajdeep Singh, and a pleasure to be back with my Indian friends again. Let me just share my screen. One sec. Here we go. Right, so the task today is just to talk about faster insulins and hope or hype, what the actual evidence is and what the actual advances are. So of course, it's a good time to be talking about insulin, about almost now coming up to the 100-year anniversary of the discovery of insulin over the next year or so. And just on the right, there is a picture I took in the Nobel Museum in Stockholm of one of the first vials of insulin in the syringes from back in the 1920s, when insulin was, extracted from pork or beef extracts and given to people. And of course, the chemical structure of insulin was one of the first proteins to be synthesized. The chemical structure you're all familiar with the A and B protein, and then with the analogues, you can move the aspartate or the proline at the 0.28 of the B chain, and that affects the ability of the insulin to dissociate. So what you see on the right-hand side here are actually hexamers. You can see red and blue. These all are 6 insulin molecules with a zinc molecule in between. So that's how the insulin hexamers exist. And the way in which you can get the insulin to act, so whenever you put it in solution, it exists in these hexamers. And the way you get it to act quickly is by altering slightly the structure. So these hexamers dissociate under the skin slightly quicker. So that's basically when you do lispro or aspart, it helps these hexamers to break up quicker, and that's what speeds the absorption. And of course, so insulin was not only the first protein to be, the chemical structure to be identified by Sanger in 1970, it was also the first protein to be synthesized in the lab first and used clinically. So, we've gone from kind of a lot of people that you might be looking at might be on regular soluble insulin. Is the cheapest one that's out there. That's why it suits for a lot of people. But nowadays, most of us would agree that using one of the analogs like insulin lispro, which you get in Humalog, insulin aspart, which you can get as Novorapid, or insulin glulicine, which comes from Salacedra, are the 3 analogs that are now much more widely used. Now, when these analogs came around about 20 years ago now, they made 25 years ago, they made a big difference to the post-meal glucose readings. Again, when these insulins were compared with the original regular insulin, at that time, there was no huge difference in HbA1c, but the big difference was post-meal hypoglycemia. And there's about a 25% reduction in hypoglycemia with any of these 3 insulin analogs. The time action curves of these analogs are roughly the same. So actually, there is absolutely no advantage in moving between these 3 analogs. They pharmacologically, they're absolutely interchangeable. But now we're at the generation of the second generation, or the ultra fast acting insulins. And there are 2 on the market at the moment, certainly here in the UK. One is Fiasp, or faster acting aspart, and the other is Limujev, which is the insulin lispro AABG. So let's talk a little bit more about these newer insulins. But firstly, let's think about why there is still a need. You had regular insulin aspart, people were doing well with that. You had the normal analogs. And what we realize is that the main reason why we need fast-acting insulin analogs is these insulins still are not fast enough compared to what we need. Because to work best, they need to be given pre-meal, and many of our patients don't do that. we're also realizing now as we move into a phase, particularly with type 1 diabetes, where, in the past, people used to manage with 2 injections a day. And now we are saying that to get HbA1c of 7%, those patients who are achieving HbA1c of 7% are doing at least 5 to 7 boluses per day. Right. So with people doing, and so what we're learning is that actually doing 3 injections a day, you cannot get target HbA1c. And with these frequent insulins now, you need a faster on, faster off to stop them stacking. And that's where the drive for the faster insulins is coming. So what we're trying to do, these are curves taken. You take medical students, take them to the lab and feed them 50 grams of carbohydrate 3 times a day. And if you measure their plasma insulin every 20 minutes, this is the curve that you get. And what you realize is you have a very fast spike. The peak insulin occurs within 10 minutes of eating. And actually, if you look at some of the studies, they show that the rise of insulin happens even in the cephalic phase. So even before we eat. And then when you look at it, actually, if you model it, 50% of the insulin is as basal and 50% is as rapid acting, okay, or bolus insulin. If you look at a CGM trace of someone with type 1 diabetes in particular, what you notice is not just a day-to-day variability in glucose at the same time, but these very rapid spikes. So whenever the insulin is given just after the meal, if you use a Libre, a flash glucose monitoring or anything like that, you will see the glucose trace go straight up, even if the insulin is given just pre-meal. And actually, if you look at the excursions here, you've got a glucose of between 6 here, pre-meal, 6 is about 100 milligram per deciliter, and post-meal, it's rising to about almost 20, which can be almost 350 milligram per deciliter. So the average rise post-meal is almost 150 milligram per deciliter if you were to measure it at 1 hour post-meal. Now in India, when we do blood testing, you often do pre-meal and PP, which is 2 hours post-meal. Actually, by 2 hours, the glucose is coming down and you've missed the peak because the peak of glucose is always at 1 hour. That's why in pregnancy, we always ask for testing at 1 hour. And even if we look at people who are well controlled, so this is the trace of someone who is, got an HbA1c of 7.2% using Libre, scanning 10 times a day. But even here, if you can see, if I just, sorry. If you look at the meal times, the patient is trying to take the insulin pre-meal, but even from a good range, the glucose is rising to about 14, 15, which is past 200 at 1 hour post-meal. And then if they try and correct that, they come down and it causes post-meal hypoglycemia. So we're seeing this affect their ability to control the glucose. Here again, you've got someone who's in range pre-meal, but post-meal glucose rising to about almost 350. Again, here for the evening meal. So whatever this person does, they cannot control the post-meal glucose, and that's what's limiting the ability of the HbA1c to come down below 7%. Then what we also realize is that as if your HbA1c is 9%, then basically you're under-insulinized all over. And the big proportion of the high glucose is coming from basal insulin. But as you get people closer to target, you've got them basal enough. Now the big contributor to the overall glycemic profile tends to be more the postprandial glucose. So the better controlled you are, the more important it becomes to get this post-meal glucose in target. And the ability to this, so these are some nice experiments done, which show that the timing of insulin is everything. Many of our patients will be injecting just before they eat or after. They're scared to take the insulin pre-meal because they're worried about hypoglycemia. But if you look at this, here the mean glucose is about 150 pre-meal. And if you inject 20 minutes pre-meal, 20 minutes, you can see the rise there from about 160 up to 180. So the rise is 20 or 30 milligram per deciliter. But if you're injecting post-meal or even as you start eating, the average rise here is almost 100 milligram per deciliter. And actually, there was a randomized study that took injecting pre-meal versus post-meal and found out that with post-meal, not only is the 1 hour peak much higher, but there is a 20% higher risk of hypoglycemia that happens at about 3 hours post-meal. So we know that the optimal timing of insulin is about 20 minutes pre-meal, but we also know that if we go and ask people to inject 20 minutes pre-meal, very few of our patients can do that because they live busy lives, and secondly, will be willing to do that because they're scared of hypoglycemia. Now, actually, realistically, if we know that insulin action doesn't occur within 20 minutes, so if someone hypos between the injection and 20 minutes, it can't be the insulin they've taken. It's going to be exercise or previous insulin that's caused the hypo, right? So if someone hypos within the first half hour post-injection, then that cannot be the insulin they've taken, because insulin just doesn't work that fast. In fact, in my clinic, we have a joke running. I call Novo Rapid, we call it Novo Sluggish or Humo Slug, because it is slow. And these newer insulins are slightly less sluggish, but there's some advantage. So if you look at, this is the data from the type 1 diabetes exchange registry from the US, 25,000 people. And they compared people who were achieving target glucose of 6.5% versus those who are high. And this found that people achieving target were measuring their glucose 5 to 9 times a day, were doing 4 to 7 injections per day of quick-acting insulin. And those people who were running high were doing 2 to 4 injections per day and 2 to 4 measurements per day. The other key difference was 80% of those in good control were injecting pre-meal, whereas only about 50% of those with poor control were injecting pre-meal. Many of them were injecting post-meal. And if you were to ask them, when do you take your injection? And if the patient says, oh, just as I eat or after, ask a second question. So how many times is it more than half an hour post-meal that you inject? Because once you said you're going to do it after, then you clean up the bartan, you do whatever else you're doing. And then sometimes you remember to take insulin a little bit later. And that means that people who are injecting post-meal are much more likely to miss their bolus and much more likely not to measure their glucose as well. And so although they're taking the insulin, they're not getting the benefit, because if you take the insulin post-meal, by the time the insulin starts to work, the sugar is already 80 to 100 milligrams higher. So here again, another study, only 21% were injecting pre-meal. 44% of people, this is a survey from the US, were injecting immediately at the start, and then up to 30% were injecting post-meal. And you know, this extends even to people who are on the most advanced of technologies. So here you've got the kind of most advanced technology you can get, which is a Medtronic closed loop pump. And the black line here is the glucose levels. And here underneath, you can see the insulin delivery, and these purple lines are when the patient is doing a bolus. And you know, each of these is 1 day. So that's Tuesday, that's Wednesday. And all I want to show you here is just look at what happens. The patient is injecting pre-meal. They've done a glucose measurement pre-meal, and see the glucose rise. The pump has got it overnight at a perfect target of 120 milligrams per deciliter. Patient is late on their bolus, and immediately the glucose is up at 17. 17 is again around about 350. And it takes the pump 3 hours to get that glucose back down to target. And then again, the patient eats, and again for 3 hours, 4 hours, the glucose is out of target. And that's why a patient eats 3 meals. Each meal that you're out of range for 3 hours, that's 10 hours out of range. And that's because we can't get enough insulin in quickly to kill that post-meal spike. If you increase the insulin, it doesn't change the peak. It only increases the risk of late hypoglycemia, because increase in the dose doesn't make it appear quicker. It just gives you a higher peak, which will appear at 1 or 90 minutes or so, 65 minutes post-injection. So the new advances are FASP and Limogev. And so what you've got with FASP is you've got, basically they haven't changed the chemical structure at all. So they haven't been able to change the hexamers, there's no molecular change. All they've done is they've added vitamin B3. And what this does is this helps the insulin dissociate when it's injected post-meal, injected into the skin. And with Limogev, instead of taking that action, they've added a vitamin C and treprostinil. So treprostinil is a prostaglandin. What it does is it causes local vasodilation. And so when you do the injection, because of the vasodilation, it gets into the bloodstream slightly quicker. Okay, and so so these are two slightly different strategies for increasing the delivery of insulin, the monomers of insulin from the subcutaneous depot. So you take 10 units, it's in the skin, to get it from there into the bloodstream. So these two advances are there. And then just a bit of a mindset. So as in the insulin, they tried, so this is some data back from Tim Heise, who's worked with Novo on a lot of these studies. And what they've done is you alter the zinc concentration. And as you can see, as the zinc concentration goes down, you remember that zinc was the molecule in the middle of the hexamers. As you bring the zinc down, the dissociation goes up. As you increase the niacinamide, vitamin B3, again, the breakup of the plasma insulin absorption happens better, but you lose stability. So they've done a lot of studies, found out the sweet spot in between of helping the stability in solution, but also being able to get out quicker. And as you look at what happens in the study, the blue line here is fast-fast part, and the gray line is normal insulin aspart or novorapid. And you can see here just a slight left shift of the line. So this is about gaining you 10 minutes in terms of getting to peak insulin 10 minutes quicker. Now look at the timeline here. When I showed you that slide of what happens in the human, normal human, you and I, our peak insulin happens at about 10 minutes post meal. Even here, the peak here is moving from around about 50 minutes to 40 minutes. So it is still 30 minutes behind what it needs to be, but slightly quicker. And you can see here, the insulin delivery in that first hour is also slightly more. It's about 20% higher insulin delivery in the first hour. So these chemical changes certainly have pharmacodynamic benefits. And actually, when you compare, this is a study again by Tim Heise, and he's compared all the 4 insulins. I want to take this slide a little bit slower. So this is serum insulin. And if you can see, you've got the aspart and lispro here at the bottom in the light blue and the gray. And you can see they're almost exactly one above the other, all the way out to 1 hour post injection. When you get the peak insulin is around about 0.7 to 1 hour. So that's about 45 minutes to 1 hour is the peak insulin. And roughly it's the same. Here it's showing aspart slightly higher peak, but in terms of speed of onset, there's nothing between them. You look at faster aspart, which is the dark navy blue, you can see much quicker. So at 20 minutes post meal, it's almost double the amount of insulin is there. And if you look at ultra rapid lispro, which is Limogev, that is again slightly higher. You can see here the peak levels are the same, but you're just getting that peak. Instead of getting to that peak at 50 minutes, you get to that peak at about 0.5 of an hour, which is 30 minutes. If you look on the right, this is a very interesting data when they look at not the insulin levels, but actually the post-meal glucose. And so I want to draw your, let me just, let me draw your attention to the gray line here, because the gray line down here is actually the healthy subjects. So this gray line here is healthy subjects. And so you can see you got a peak insulin very quickly, and then it stays pretty high for about 2 hours, and then it comes down. And now look at what happens with lispro and aspart. This is the gray and the kind of light blue here. The peak happens at about 1 hour. It stays high, and both of the traces are superimposable. So it doesn't matter if you use Novorapid or Humalog, you get pretty much the same profile. The aspart here gives you a lower peak, but it's slightly faster. This is the glucose rise. Sorry, it's not the insulin levels. So the glucose goes much higher if you give them faster lispro or aspart, and stays higher for 2 hours. If you give them faster aspart, the dark blue, you can see the peak glucose is higher than healthy subjects, and later on also the glucose is higher. And then the red is ultra rapid lispro, and the peak here is actually lower than the peak in healthy subjects. But then later on, after 2 hours, you can see when the normal insulin still has some effect, this one is faster off. And so the glucose starts to rise a little bit later. So this is just showing you that maybe with these fast-acting insulins, we can kill that initial post-meal glucose rise. So let's see what happened in the research studies. So the first study was onset 1. This was in type 1 diabetes. And you can see here, the most interesting part of this study, to my mind, was the fact that if you see what happened, they came in at an HbA1c of 8%. This is average for study population, motivated patients who are doing well in Europe. Average HbA1c is still about 8%. We can't get them down below 7. I know in your main chamber, there was a discussion about why patients aren't to target. It's because it's tough, part of the reason. And you can see here, but once you go into a study, just the study effect, they drop from 8% to 7.6. So 0.5% drop just because in the study, they were being asked to inject pre-meal, measure their glucose regularly. Just maybe because you're in a study, you become a bit more motivated. And actually, through the study, the difference in HbA1c didn't really change much. But here, the dark blue line, which is the faster aspart, you can see just dropped a little bit more, and in the end, ended up being below aspart. They had a funny idea to try and use the aspart post-meal, which didn't work because actually that was the worst outcome. And it's very strange that a lot of Novo's marketing has been this insulin can be given post-meal, which I don't understand at all because it's the worst outcome. And we know that even when you give it pre-meal, it's going to be slower than what we need. So I must admit, I find it very strange that it's being marketed as a post-meal insulin. What we can say is when we give it pre-meal, it functions better than normal aspart. And given pre-meal, it functions the same as normal aspart given 20 minutes pre-meal. If you give it just before meal, And you can see here with a fixed meal there, look at the increment, the plasma increment after medium bolus at 1 hour, 6 meals, 120 milligram per deciliter. So when you give no rapid, your post-meal spike is 120. If you give it 5 hours, then the post-meal spike is 4, which is 80. 80 or this peak is 5. So maybe you're buying 20-25 milligram per deciliter reduction in the peak insulin, but still a rise of 100. So let's have a see what happens in type 2 diabetes. In type 2 diabetes, there's no difference. No difference between fasting and aspart. Even the difference post meal is also much less. So it's a bit disappointing. And again, here also you see that actually once there is a study, there was a dose optimization, both the groups improved by about 0.5%. The biggest impact was actually taking part in a study, being asked to measure your glucose more frequently, being seen by a study team, and you get a 1% drop in HbA1c. But actually the insulin didn't seem to have any benefit. Let's see what's the difference in HbA1c. Of course, what are the reasons, if I go back here, reasons why there was no difference in HbA1c is that these are treatment target studies. So in the next talk, we'll see a lot of these studies show the same big difference in hypoglycemia. So let's see if that's the same in basal bolus as well. Actually, if you look at onset 1 and onset 2, there were really no differences in either severe hypoglycemia, 1 hour post meal or 2 hour post meal. The numbers there are so similar. No significant difference in hypoglycemia either. So, when you compare regular insulin, which is ActRapid with NovoRapid, or Humalin S with Humalog, you see about a 20% reduction in hypoglycemia. But with the fast-acting aspart, we didn't see that. Was there any difference in pumps? Again, in pumps, actually, if you look at the blue line, this is a study done in young people, whereas this is an adult with type 2 diabetes on pump. Actually, with fast aspart, the HbA1c is a tiny bit higher. No significant difference in hypoglycemia, no difference in HbA1c either. And the hypothesis here was that, we thought this would be where it really benefit because the pump patients are doing low boluses, but there was no difference here either. This was again strange, disappointing. No one's really sure why we got these results. Maybe one of the answers in one of the CGM sub studies. You can see here the post-meal spikes, the blue lines are lower than the gray lines, showing that the post-meal levels are lower. But if you look at the figure D, the other side, you can see that pre-meal levels are always higher. And one of the things we are thinking is maybe that's because if you're using a fast-acting insulin, you have to get a higher basal percentage. Because if you look at the other
Dr. Pratik, sir, your voice is breaking continuously. I think that the internet connection is slightly unstable.
I'm sorry. Okay.
I think with Brexit, the internet connection has also been taken away by EU.
I think it's because of the lockdowns.
There's some echo also that's coming. Echo also coming. Back end people could just look into it. Back end people could just look into it.
Dr. Sengupta, the echo is even when you're speaking. So I think it's...
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I think there's something that the backend people need to just look up.
Okay, I will call RXT.
If I speak a little slower, I get better. Are you able to hear me?
So,
Can you hear me? So if you look at what happens with the fast-acting, rapid-acting liposome, here you see again in the studies, by coming into the study, there's an improvement in HbA1c. coming to study the improvement in HbA1c, but again, there is no difference between the Lispro and the ultra-rapid Lispro. Again, the post-meal glucose is better with the new instance, but the HbA1cs are not that much different. Here there was again in type 2 diabetes, again, no difference in HbA1c, but a low post-meal glucose, and again, no difference in hypoglycemia either. With pumps also not much difference. So I'm just going to go to this one. My thoughts on the data are that the ultra-rapid insulins are less impressive than expected. Maybe you need much more frequent bolusing to get the benefits, and these insulins are better for those people who want to get the tightest control. Maybe the gains in the first hour post-meal are lost a little 3 or 4 hours later, particularly with high-fat meals. And maybe we need to have a higher basal percentage with these patients. There is certainly better post-meal control, and for those people really tight, this is beneficial, but it still needs to be taken premium. And so for any given time of injection, your post-meal peak will be 20